Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our third session as part of the THF Talk series. The series forms part of the programming of FICA's newest grant platform, the Himalayan Fellowship for Creative Practitioners, launched in partnership with Royal Enfield last year. This unique fellowship program opened as a new initiative for the Himalayan belt, and it aims to support and empower creative practitioners, individuals, and collectives working at the intersection of ecology and cultural knowledge in the western and eastern Himalayan regions. As a platform encouraging innovative and experimental approaches to art making, this fellowship is a way for us to spotlight issues relating to ecology and intangible cultural heritage while forming closer associations and a deep understanding of local cultural and natural resources. So we were really thrilled to select the program's first cohort of 10 creative practitioners last year. And we hope to facilitate a free-flowing exchange of ideas and practices between artists, resource persons, conservationists, and communities over the coming year. With this in mind, the THF Talk series was co-conceptualized by our fellowship consultants, Dr. Monisha Ahmed and Mary Therese Kurkalang, as a public-facing forum for THF. So for our first session, we hosted the wonderful Professor G.N. Devi, who expanded on the relationships between language, stories, identity, and how they shape our perceptions of time and space. We followed that with a session by writer Stephen Alter, who discussed the many ways in which Himalayan landscapes and their biodiversity can serve as inspiration for creative expression in different genres. And for our third session today, we're thrilled to have Elika Assumi and Anna Moulton as speakers, with Mary as our moderator. Mary Therese Kurkalang has worked in Indian and international publishing and culture sectors for close to 30 years, with a focus on the northeastern region of India for over a decade. She is festival director of the Shillong Literary Festival since its first edition in 2021, the co-founder of the Ratna Books Writers Residency, and a consultant to the Himalayan Fellowship. Her background is in publishing, arts management, and conflict resolution. I'd now like to hand it over to Mary to introduce our speakers and to take this session forward. Thank you all once again for joining us today.
Good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you, Annalisa, also to the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art for organizing and hosting this series, and our supporter, Royal Enfield. I welcome both our speakers today, Anna Moulton and Elika Assumi. Thank you for making the time for this interaction and earlier while we discuss and prepared for today. Anna, thank you for adjusting your clock here to our clock here. It's already pretty late where you're at in Australia. I will now shortly introduce our speakers and invite them to deliver their talks, following which we will have a short interaction between us, and we will then open up to questions from our listeners and participants today. Anna Moulton has worked with First Nations writers, storytellers, and artists from around Australia for more than 20 years. She was most recently CEO of Magabala Books, Australia's leading Indigenous publishing house, for almost 10 years. She has a background in arts management and law, specializing in strategic planning and business development, organizational change, advocacy, and policy development. Elika Assumi, hailing from Nagaland, is an assistant professor at the National Law University, Meghalaya, focusing on the distinct and subjective narratives of India's northeastern region. Her scholarly pursuits revolve around unraveling the nuances of this culturally rich terrain through the medium of literature and academic discourse. I now invite Elika to speak to us.
Thank you, Mary, for the kind introduction. Let me just quickly share my screen and then we can begin. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Right. Okay. So let me begin by saying that I have always hoped to speak and write, taking the example of our better elders, those who have spoken and written with courage in a language not our own, and paved the way for a generation of new writers and performers among the Nagas. I do not claim to be an expert of the Naga knowledges. I'm still learning. And what I would like to share today is only a small part of my understanding. I wish to narrate a story, one which we may have heard varied versions from our grandparents and elders. The story of how the Naga written script on parchment was given by some god to two brave warriors. In a rather curious turn of events, the parchment containing our treasured written script was devoured by a hungry dog. In the following turn, the sated animal was further consumed by the brave warriors. The meat, found to be delectable, thus finding its way into a tradition of delicacy. When I reflect upon this popular Naga folktale, I am struck by its simplicity, at how language was recognized as having a symbolic potential. It is also a shared folktale, surprisingly cutting across linguistic barriers and tribal identities, signaling one of the few points of commonality for the people now known as the Nagas. The word Naga has vague, maybe even problematic origins. The word itself has been variously attributed to referring to a people with pierced ears or noka, for example, or people who are naked or noga. But it has been appropriated as a means to collectively describe the many tribes who reside in this northeastern corner of India, such as the Angami, Ao, Chakasang, Chang, Kachari, Khamnungan, Konyak, Kuki, Lotha, Pom, Puchuri, Rengma, Sangtam, Sumi, or Sema, Dikir, Yimkyung, and Zeliang. Altogether, 17 tribes comprising about 2 million people each with their distinct languages and sub-dialects and customary practices in Nagaland. In this sense, Naganess is a dynamic embodiment of many cultural and political position. Some hegemonic, some regressive, some even given to simplistic binaries, such as the idea of a greater Nagalim or Nagaland pitched against the notion of an oppressive and threatening mainstream. But more importantly, it is now accepted as a point of departure to talk about shared worldviews. It is not the purpose of this talk to give a historical account. Rather, I wish to ask the question that pervades us Nagas today. What is Naganess? Let me first turn to some of the scholarship on the role of oral traditions in a world dominated by written communication. I'm fond of referring to Walter Ong, for example, and his influential work, Orality and Literacy, where he pointed out that writing fundamentally transforms human consciousness and theorized that writing, like any technology, profoundly alters the way we think. This same dilemma confronts our Naga cultural heritage. We want to preserve our oral traditions, the songs of our mothers and grandmothers, sung to us as lullabies, songs in the Jhum fields, chants that help make the mundane and the back-breaking task of working on hill slopes a bit more than just that, a means to communicate and share in the pains of everyday life. We want to preserve these aspects of our culture, but pragmatically, the means to do so has come to us in the technological turn. We can write, we can record, document, and show that there is a commonality that can be said to be found among the diversity of tongues and ethnicities. Tribes can see each other's worlds where previously an oral tradition was only understood and appreciated by its own group. Ong believed that without the development of writing systems, human cognition would have evolved along strikingly different lines. However, this kind of technological determinism has been met with criticism. And I think it resonates more jarringly in the current age of artificial intelligence, where language is coded in ways that synthesizes its role as data rather than as a means to symbolically grapple with reality. But there is a key question that can be raised here. How does the shift from preserving knowledge orally to relying on written records impact the way we understand the world? For the Nagas, the symbolic turn to a script that has been hypermediated by religion, colonialism, and the internal imperialism now faced, we could think of this question as hinging on a pragmatic urgency rather than a theoretical one. The dominance of writing has spurred, interestingly, an increased concern for our oral tradition and how to preserve what may be lost. These traditions are now a deliberate and conscious act, exhibiting a mindfulness about the role of technologies such as writing and new media that can be harnessed as platforms to staying rooted to traditional practices. One of our most celebrated and beloved Naga writers in English, Tamsula Au, who passed away in 2022, in her seminal essay, Writing Orality, asks a crucial question. How do Naga cultures that rely on written traditions handle their inherited oral traditions? She cited the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, as a prime example. Au notes that it was Elias Lonrot who collected and compiled these stories originally passed down through oral tradition. And she points out, Lonrot transformed these local tales into a national literary treasure, bridging the gap between oral traditions and written literature. This process has led to the emergence of a new kind of literature, one that blends elements of storytelling with contemporary perspectives. These allows writers to move away, as Au believed, from Western dominant models and create works that are both deeply rooted in tradition and infused with modern sensibilities. Au positions herself within this movement of writers from Nagaland. And I take inspiration from this as well, in that orality and literacy from Nagaland or orality and literacy, or the spoken and the written word, are on a spectrum rather than pitching one against the other. For instance, I can remember many different versions of the trickster Apfuho's stories being narrated to me by my grandmother and my mother. And even to this day, each time I ask my mother to tell me the story, a slightly tweaked rendition emerges. This emphasis on storytelling is what makes oral traditions a cornerstone of Naga literature. Similarly, Au and other writers in this region use the written word to keep past memories alive. Their work represents a bridge between the oral and the written, paving the way for new forms of understanding and expression. See, Naga folktales often feature stories about relationships between humans and animals. This focus on nature reflects a common theme in oral cultures around the world. Animals play a prominent role in these stories. For instance, markings on gateposts and totems are carved with a variety of animals, primarily monitor lizards, bill, tigers, snakes, mitoons, or roosters. In fact, the rooster has a crucial role in the divination practices of the tribes, just as it is in other parts of the world. However, the arrival of Christianity in the colonial era significantly impacted these traditions, which was also, funnily enough, a radical shift from the initial do-nothing stance of the British administration, as noted by the historian S.K. Barpujari. So Barpujari notes that British viewed the Naga Hills as inhabited by, in the words of the principal assistant of Naugang in 1840, Lieutenant Big, who generalized the Nagas as ignorant and prejudiced. This position paved the way for the American Baptists to evangelize the Naga Hills, but many missionaries, when confronted by the rich oral tradition and stories of the Nagas, often dismissed the stories as mere fables or even works of the devil, fearing that they would lead people away from Christian teachings. Many traditional stories that involved contact with spirits or otherworldly beings were discouraged. As a result, storytelling in the post-Christian era shifted towards themes more aligned with Christian beliefs. This can be seen in some aspects of Naga literature and performance even to this day. So this led to a period where many Nagas rejected their cultural heritage in favor of Christian themes and structures and internalized a sense of inferiority in relation to their cultural roots. However, It is important to note that this wasn't a complete rejection. The current traditional practices suggest that cultures are constantly evolving and adapting. In the case of the Nagas, some Christian themes may have been incorporated into storytelling, but this doesn't mean their traditional stories have completely disappeared. Today, there is a growing movement to reclaim and celebrate these stories, creating a unique blend of old and new traditions. Interestingly, the very ethnographic generalizations that denigrated the Naga tribes can now be referred back as the means to contest hegemonic intrusion into what it means to be a Naga. One of the significant consequences of introducing literacy among the Nagas was the decline of the traditional knowledge systems like the Morung or the youth dormitory. In Nagaland, the Morung institution is called differently in different tribes, by different tribes. It is known as Ban in Konyak, Kichuki in Angami, Aruju in Ao, Chumpo in Lotha, Apuki in Sema, and so forth. The Morung, or the bachelor dormitory system, was an essential part of Naga life, such that, apart from the family, it was the most important learning and knowledge setup of the people. With the arrival of the American Baptist missionaries and British administration, literacy was introduced primarily for religious purposes, reading the Bible, and training office workers. Schools with dormitories replaced the Morung system, and the churches built separate living quarters for young men and women within these communities. Nonetheless, the introduction of writing by American missionaries marked a significant change in Naga culture. Literacy opened new doors, allowing Nagas to access information and ideas that weren't possible before, just as new media is once again transforming the representation and expression of Naga culture. As we explore the concepts of folklore, oral tradition, and verbal arts, we can pose the following question. 1. Can stories move seamlessly between oral, written, and performed forms within the Naga context? 2. In an age of migration and global influences, what is pure Naga oral tradition? And number 3, how do oral traditions adapt and survive in a digital age where information is constantly shared and remixed? Despite the prominence of technology, oral traditions are not disappearing. Rather, they are evolving and finding new avenues of expression. Storytellers are gaining recognition, traditional tales are being adapted into literature, and new music and poetry draw inspiration from folk traditions. I would now like to also address briefly the paths of oral tradition transitioning to the manifestation in performance and physical expression. And for this, let me draw some current examples. The first being Run Monday Run. This band was formed in 2008, and it's a uniquely alternative band in the Nagaland music scene. Likely the region's first and only folktronica band, as they explain. And folktronica merges the deeply traditional with the cutting-edge electronic sounds. They see it as a way to honor their roots while introducing a fresh modern feel. Their debut single, Waza, boldly exemplifies this approach. Waza is a reimagining of a traditional Moulton or one of the Ao dialects, folk song of courtship, often sung in the Morung. In this song, both boys and girls are portrayed as waza or birds. The band spent months researching the song, including collecting diverse chants and seeking insights from elders to fully understand the lyrics. When creating Waza, Run Monday Run stayed true to the original lyrics but experimented with new melodies. Let me also highlight the song Zongza, which is about Gina and Etiben, an Ao Naga folktale about tragic lovers separated by social differences. In these ways, the delicate balance of honoring the old and embracing the new is at the heart of Run Monday Run's creativity. Everyday storytelling has found a niche in today's social media-dominated world, such as Ken's vlog. Ken's vlog is a popular YouTube vlog with a subscriber count of 683K, and on his channel, the mighty Naga King Chili lovingly adorns the banner. He describes his channel like so, and I quote, This channel is all about our daily life in Northeast Nagaland and also about cooking and eating extreme level spicy food and bizarre unique food of Northeast India, Nagaland. It is rather inconceivable that Kent showcases his mukbang prowess of eating extremely spicy food with everyday life in Nagaland. And his food eating moments are interjected with snippets of the various phases of Joom farming, from the slash and burn phase to sowing, to weeding, to harvesting. In the process, his videos, which are self-recorded, document vital moments of everyday performances. So working in the field, explaining wildlife, but also foraging for food, identifying forest essentials, skills related to cooking and work in general. And the highlight of his video is a spicy meal while casually munching on a Naga king chili, occasionally saying, "Jhal ase," or "it is spicy." I would also like to take the instance of Leshelimi, a unique group of church-based mothers who function as a catering group, singing group, an informal cooperative, and self-help group. These group of women are popular cooks for wedding feast, specializing in crispy pork and mushroom and chives chutney. What is noteworthy about this group is that they are also an informal co-op and self-help group supporting women entrepreneurs running small businesses and are also a singing group. Their gospel songs are sung in Assumi, and their group is often called for church conferences. Much of their music video recordings expenses are met through their catering and other business profits. Next, I would like to turn your attention to Naga Genus, a Assumi folk and gospel choral group focusing on reviving traditional musical instruments, chants, and tunes. For instance, a description of the video and of their song Kasho Papu or Kuku reads as you see on the slide. Naga Genus, as they note, is on a mission to breathe new life into the musical heritage of our ancestors. Their evocative song, Kashu Papu, celebrates the start of the sowing season, emphasizing natural melodies and the traditional instruments like the wind chimes or kukupu and the bamboo pitcher or the lezahu. Farmers' sowing chants blend seamlessly, creating a soundscape deeply rooted in their land and its rhythms. They have become known for their trademark sound, defined by the use of instruments handcrafted from local materials like bamboo, wood, and creepers. These are not just recreations, rather are carefully designed, named, and each instrument is meticulously tuned. The group comprises of 14 members, led by the inimitable Hojevi Kapo and his wife. So in conclusion, I would like to thank everyone for this opportunity to showcase some aspects of my shared culture. Some of these examples are important to me as they also go beyond the truncations of class and gender. Some of the women in the cooking group, for example, are from working class backgrounds and have found the means to a sustained livelihood and a sense of community. Kent of Kent's Vlog is a farmer, but he has found a voice in YouTube and is highlighting the unique food culture of the Nagas, such as our love of fermented foods and the richness of traditional food culture that is not only healthy, but sustainable. The singers are classically trained, but are using their notational skills to enhance the traditional folk tunes and chants. What this tells me, as someone who both witnesses and takes pleasure in the artistic and creative achievements of the Nagas, is that Nagas are slowly celebrating their own cultures rather than being engaged in a debate of whether the same cultures are acceptable or not. I leave you with a tune from Naga Genus, Silumi and Supumi, for your listening pleasure. So let me try to play this one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elika, for that really insightful talk. I think I can confidently speak on behalf of everyone here that you've left us with so much to think about and also hungry. I mean, love that note of music you ended on as well. Thank you. And, before I invite Anna, I think since Elika's talk is just fresh in our minds, if any of you have questions, please feel free to post them on the chat and we'll address them a little later. And now I invite Anna to talk to us.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary. And Elika, I feel like I could give a whole different talk now to the one that I have actually prepared. I wouldn't necessarily be qualified to give it, but it raises so many issues and there are so many parallels with the experience of First Nations people here in Australia. First of all, I would like to thank you, Mary, Ishwari, and the FICA team, and Elika for your incredible presentation. I'd just like to acknowledge that here I am on the unceded sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people in the place that's also known as Melbourne, Australia. I'd just like to clarify that I'm a non-Indigenous person and I've had the privilege of working with Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout Australia for about 25 years, and most recently as the CEO of Muggabala Books. I'm not representing Muggabala Books tonight, but I am speaking with their blessing because I'll be speaking a lot about my experience that I have gained while I've been working with Muggabala. And I just want to acknowledge the board of Muggabala, but particularly Rachel Binsella, who is the publisher of Muggabala Books. He's taught me so much of what I will actually talk about tonight. I'd also, I've had the pleasure twice of meeting Ruby Hembron when I've come to India a couple of times. And I just want to acknowledge her work and the work of Advani in India, that incredible body of work that they have published. And just in terms of the publishing journey of Indigenous publisher, there are so many parallels between Muggabala Books' journey and Advani. And one of the organisations just on the next slide that I'd like to acknowledge as well is Warman Arts Centre. I worked at Warman Arts Centre, just that second slide, thank you. Quite a long time ago now, more than 20 years ago, but I've kept a relationship with the Arts Centre. So there I worked with visual artists and was employed by visual artists, Gidja people. And there are a lot of similar challenges experienced in the visual arts context in terms of partnerships and collaborations. And what I'll be talking about tonight is about what makes an ethical collaboration, particularly when you're working with Indigenous oral storytellers and quite often non-Indigenous collaborators. So Muggabala Books, it was set up in the 1980s, and why it was set up, there was a big cultural meeting of Aboriginal elders and cultural leaders from across the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia. That region was colonised much later than most of Australia. And so, there were people who had their first contact with a non-Indigenous person in the 1960s. And quite a number of those elders who got together in an enormous meeting in 1984 to do concerned with protecting their law and culture was a lot of those people were they called first contact, they're the first generation to have met non-Indigenous people. And what was incredible about that generation, it was the change that they experienced, but their determination to ensure that their culture was protected, was passed down to future generations, drove, the establishment of so many cultural organisations across the region, which are still strong today, including Muggabala Books. And the concern in the 1980s is there were a lot of non-Indigenous PhD candidates or master's candidates coming through from universities who wanted to study Aboriginal people. In the Kimberley, people refer to themselves as generally as Aboriginal people if they're not talking about their specific community and their specific language group. And so that's the word I'll use, but I'm sorry if I use Indigenous, First Nations and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interchangeably. But one of the challenges challenges was that people were coming in, studying, recording, taking up a lot of time from elders, and then going away and not necessarily returning that information. Or perhaps back in the 80s, a single copy of a PhD might arrive in the mail and quickly become lost, never to be seen again. And there was also a series of children's books published by a non-Indigenous woman who worked with elders around the Kimberley to produce traditional creation stories like folk tales, and that caused a lot of upset, and there was many years of trying to get back control of the rights for those stories, and so communities didn't actually receive royalties for those books. So Muggabala Books was established, and some of those very early books that were published were oral storyteller collaborations with non-Indigenous writers. So in terms of maybe on the next slide, which refers to Muggabala Books' page on its publishing process, one of the most critical, or two of the most critical points here is that in the case of a collaboration between a non-Indigenous writer and an Indigenous storyteller or writer, is that it has to be a genuine collaboration from the inception, and it has to be a minimum 50% contribution to the text. And the reason for that is that Muggabala Books only publishes Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous voices. And so sometimes what does happen is that non-Indigenous people come to Muggabala with a story they have written, and then they're seeking to bring on Indigenous people later on in the picture to try and get published, or sometimes it's there's a genuine intent, but it's often misplaced. So those are not books that are appropriate for Muggabala to consider. But where there is a collaboration that seems appropriate, Muggabala looks very carefully at the process and the relationships behind the collaboration. And so behind these statements, there lies so much detail. And tonight what I'll just try and talk about are some of the questions. What are the key considerations in these kinds of projects? But it's also, these questions are also relevant when there is a collaboration between an Indigenous writer and their community, or maybe there is an Indigenous writer who is working with another community from a different nation or language group. And then it's a slightly different focus, because then I think Muggabala Books has a great duty of care to make sure that the process is done well. Because if it doesn't end up well, when a book is published, nobody wants that to blow back on the community, especially where you're dealing with communally owned information, where there are really serious cultural responsibilities in relation to how that information is handled and treated. So one of the biggest considerations that Rachel Binsella as publisher often talks about, she says, time is our best friend. She says, time will reveal all. And what that's really, she refers to there is that, particularly in publishing, it's deadline driven and there's a lot of pressure. But sometimes also creators come to Muggabala and they say, look, we want to submit this and we want to see it published next year. And so publishing itself takes time. But at Muggabala, Rachel's very cautious to ensure that we push back on external and unrealistic deadlines, because if you rush anything, especially in collaborative or cultural projects, there really is the danger that things can be missed, that there can be miscommunication, and it's very important to ensure that you have enough time. But also time is interesting when you're dealing with a funded project or a specific project that has a timeline or a deadline. It's really important to think about what is the nature of that collaboration going to look like if you miss the deadline. In Australia, there have been many, many projects with communities where people hope to achieve something within a certain time frame. They might have had funding where they've promised that they'll achieve something by a certain time frame, but it's just not realistic because of perhaps what is happening at the community at the time. There might be community deaths, ill health, or it's just a lot more complex. And so to do the material justice, the cultural knowledge justice, and to treat the relationships with respect, it's what commitment of time is everybody prepared to make. Perhaps just on the next slide, just to give you a bit of context so you get a feeling for what sort of work Muggabala has published. This book, Yoro Yoro, by the late David Maljali, And he worked with a non-Indigenous woman who's also passed away now, Yura Malnik. So this was published in the 90s, this book. And it's interesting because it was done in a time when now, a lot is done by computer and internet in Muggabala, but this was very much about multiple road trips to one of the most remote communities in Australia up a very inaccessible road. That's actually on the far right, that's a picture of David showing other community members of the book. And so he was, again, one of that generation of really senior cultural leaders. And in order to produce this book, there were multiple meetings. I wasn't around at the time, but this is the story that I've heard and been told, is that there was great debate amongst the elders in the communities about what information was appropriate to contain in the book, what was appropriate for public consumption. And so it was quite a complex book to produce. From my personal, when I read the book, this is now totally my personal opinion, one of the things I did notice about it is that the non-Indigenous narrator was inserted into the narrative. She had quite a place in the narrative. And that's something in the contemporary publishing approach at Muggabala doesn't happen much. It's really something that we guide non-Indigenous collaborators about. And really the Indigenous storyteller would really have to want to have that person inserted in the narrative. And so it's just something that is just a change, a shift in the way that the publishing is done. And a good example of that is actually the next slide. And then this book is, on the next slide, is Yonada and Woolagudja. So this is another author who's passed away, and both authors have given permission for their names to be used publicly in association, with their books and with their work. And so you can see actually on both of those covers we have the Wandjina figure, which is a very important creation figure for 3 cultural language groups in the Kimberley region. And so Mr. Woolagudja, this book was his memoir, but it's so much more than a memoir. It's a cultural history, and he was very keen to ensure that he left this as a legacy for his family before he passed away. There's no non-Indigenous collaborator noted as an author here, but his friend and partner and long-term professional associate, Kim Doohan, is an anthropologist he'd worked with for a very long time. She's acknowledged inside the book, but the content of the book is written in his voice. It's very much his story, and he decided what would be contained in the book. This is quite a complex book to do, in terms of Muggabala did all the, and it was actually the editor, Margaret Wiskin, did all the editing, but also the design in-house to make sure that all of the information hung together beautifully and appropriately. Another example is on the next slide, which is another Kimberley example. I should notice that Muggabala works all over Australia, but for these oral storyteller collaborations, all of these examples I'm giving you, bar one, are from the Kimberley. So Shirley Purdy is one of the senior elders from Warman community, so Warman Arts Centre that I mentioned earlier. So this was a collaboration between Shirley, Warman Arts Centre and Muggabala Books. So this was to produce a children's picture book based on her story. What was interesting about this particular book, which you can see there's some stickers, award-winning book, it actually started as an art exhibition. So Shirley exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery of Australia, and there were a large number of small paintings that illustrated her life growing up on a pastoral station in the era when Aboriginal people were working as slave labourers, in the early parts through to the middle of the 20th century in Australia. And this story was written in English, but also Gidja. Well, it actually started out as being written in Gidja, her language, and it was translated by a couple of linguists within the community. One is a non-Indigenous linguist, Francis Cofer, who worked there for a very long time, and Eileen Bray, a Gidja linguist. And so to make a children's book, there were a lot of compromises. And perhaps on the next slide, you can see on the Muggabala Books website, it's a very small image, but it gives you an example. There's the beginning of her story in English, and there's the Gidja. But to work, when any children's picture book, there's always, or any book, there needs to be compromise and collaboration on the text. And so working out what was appropriate for a children's audience Some of the more brutal images from the portrait gallery show, for example, of people tied to a tree being brutally flogged. We know were decided they weren't appropriate for the age group of children that were, it was being presented to. Mugabala Books does produce books that quite a few people think is challenging because of the nature of the content. You know, some challenging and difficult things that happen in the history of First Nations people in Australia and their treatment by colonisers, the settlers, which is ongoing. But still, for some, this was a very, you know, a strong and brutal image, which was appropriate for adults, but not for this context. So just another example, a different example again, I'd just like to give you is that on the next slide. So Traditional Healers of Central Australia, Ngungkurri. This book is, you'll see that the name underneath that is actually the name of the organisation which facilitated, and that's I'll say shortly, the NPY Women's Council Aboriginal Corporation. So that organisation Mugabala Books actually won a tender to publish this book. So that organisation, on behalf of the very many contributors, you know, the Ngungkurri are the doctors of the Central Australia with traditional healing practices. And so because there were many contributors, the organisation holds the copyright and the organisation receives the benefits under the contract. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But that was a massive project with a massive amount of work went into it prior to it coming to Mugabala as publisher. So just, I'll come to the last slides later on, but just to go on to talk a bit more about what's the process. And so that question of who holds the copyright, Mugabala Books' one of its early radical acts was actually to upend Australian copyright law. You know, Australian copyright law provides that whoever writes down the story retains the copyright. So the early publishing contracts made sure that as the oral storytellers or the community or whoever, you know, the contributors think is appropriate, maintains the copyright in the story. And of course, copyright is about control, and it's about once the story is made public, it's brought into the public domain, there will be potential future uses. And of course, it is a lot more complicated in the times of AI, for example, and trying to, you know, sort of police those uses is very difficult. But we do have a copyright process in Australia, and people approach Mugabala Books and seek to use material in a whole range of ways. And so it's really is critical who gets to control that information and who. As Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you know, there's so much responsibility about how information is handled, and quite often non-Indigenous academics and writers and all sorts of people who are asked to use material, sometimes they get rejected because it's deemed inappropriate the way they want to use the material, and people really dislike it. So that's an important role that Mugabala plays in Australia, but there's how important copyright can be. And so, I mean, the understanding the implications of publishing is so important, and it seems sort of so obvious on the one level, but asking those threshold questions at the beginning of the process is so essential. You know, why make a book in the first place? What are you hoping to achieve? What kind of book? Who is it for? Is it for just the community, or do you want to have a much broader audience? And all of those questions, if you don't sort of thresh them out at the beginning, it's going to make the process a lot more difficult later on. One of the other things too is how will the information be, or the product, the book, whatever stage of the project has some kind of material outcome, whether that's, you know, recordings or whether it's actually a book. You know, how accessible is that going to be made back to the community whose knowledge fills that material? I mean, agency and control is at the heart of everything that Mugabala does. And so I think I'll just run through some of the questions that, you know, we commonly ask. And of course, what does a genuine collaboration look like? And what does that mean? And having a discussion about that and pulling that apart is really important at the outset. And a question is, whose voice is it and whose perspective? And being really clear about that as well is really critical. One of the interesting things too is to say, well, let's talk about whose idea the project was in the first place, because whose idea it was to take a project in a particular direction is so important and so subtle, because so many of the projects in Australia where they are initiated by people outside of the community, there can be, challenges associated with that. And I think that some of them in Mugaballa's sort of experience, and in my experience working with the art centre, is that when there is a drive from within the community, or an oral storyteller who is really driving the project, it's got a much greater chance of success, because it's like sometimes when that outside drive comes, there's so many dynamics. There can be a power dynamic as well. What is that dynamic of power? What is the dynamic of privilege involved? It's very hard for people to say no. I mean, even in my time at Warman Arts Centre so long ago, more PhD candidates came and asked. They talked to individual artists and said, "Can we come and live in the community? And we want to do our PhD on some aspect of your culture." And artists said yes. Yeah. And then they came to me as their employee and they said, "You've got to tell them no." Because culturally they couldn't say no to them. And so there's that cultural kind of, but there's also a power dynamic. Here are these non-Indigenous academics. How can we sort of say no? So I think, it takes a really strong process and some really open conversations, but also multiple conversations, so that people really feel comfortable, expressing how they feel about a particular project. And I think, if you're not, what are the outcomes, or the outcome that you're going for, but also having a plan for what happens if you don't achieve it is really important as well. And one of the things that Rachel has always talked about when people come with, collaborations to her, she says, whatever you do, retain the tapes of the interviews and the transcripts, but particularly the tapes, because sometimes the collaborations that are done, sometimes people don't always have, the person who's the writer doesn't always have the skills to make the most of that material, and they might need support. Or sometimes, in the case of some of the non-Indigenous collaborators, they really get it wrong and they really, stuff up the voice in particular. They really put their own lens and have all this unconscious editing or conscious editing that goes on. And so, it's just like, we say to people, if you don't keep those tapes, you've wasted everybody's time. And the great thing about tapes can always be transcribed. That's a resource for the families and in the communities that they can hold on to. So coming back to the agreement, of course, having a clear agreement, and contracts are great, but really I think even a simple MOU, which sort of sets out, addresses all of these sorts of questions, can be a lot more powerful, keeping something really simple, even if it's a video agreement, if it doesn't even have to be in writing. Because there is something, having a legal contract for publishing is important, because you're going into a domain where, in our case, Australian law prevails. And it's also the right thing to do to have a written contract. But as soon as you get a really high, what we call in Australia, high English, complex legal contract, I mean, most people know, hardly anyone reads them properly. And so having a really simple project outline that everybody agrees on is really important. The cultural protocol question is also important, because who has the right to tell a story? That's not always clear. Mugabal has been approached by lots of people saying, why aren't there more creation stories and picture books for children in Australia? We need to do them. They need to be in schools. And I think the answer to that question is that they're really complex. And not many of them have come to Mugabala. The ones that we see a lot that have been out there in the market have been quite a few have been initiated by non-Indigenous people. But I know of one book about a historical event that was initiated by a non-Indigenous person, well-intentioned, and they got permission from a young person in a community. But perhaps, I'm not sure that young person did have the authority, but people later on said, well, we would like to do that story ourselves. There's also, that book has taken up its place in the market. So it's just like, well, it's really important to find out who has the right to tell the story. Is it communally owned or not? And, questions of restricted information or otherwise, those things need to be discussed as well at the outset. And ultimately, if you're looking at a book, in Australia, people get copy royalties. There's not a lot of money in books, but it's still a question of who has the right to receive benefits. And sometimes it is easier to make an organisation receive benefits in perpetuity. there are different pathways to publishing. And, I think that can really influence what sort of project, if you want to make a book, what sort of pathway you go down. I don't actually know much about self-publishing, to be honest, but it's sort of another form of self-publishing in Australia is called custom publishing. And so that's when, if you have money up front, you pay for your service, and then somebody will edit your book, design it, and get it printed for you. Then you get, say, 1,000 copies of the book for you to do what you want with. That's often the model, actually, for art catalogues. That's one of the questions about that is that how can you distribute your books? And so it's also a question of, where do you want to send them around? Do you want them to get into bookshops? But also, if you need to reprint, you're going to have to find the money to do that yourself. The benefits of going to a publisher is that the publisher in Australia will take on the financial risk. And so they will, pay the cost of the editing and the design and the printing, and they will also ensure the distribution. But then the other side of that is that there is ultimately always collaboration and compromise, particularly on the side of, editing. It might be because it's got to be a realistic page number. We had one enormous book that came to Mugabala that would have been 500 or 600 pages, if all of that important content was included. But instead, that's just not financially viable in Australia to print a book that big. And so it had to be edited back. And those decisions about what went in and what, was left out were made by the community partner, the group, who had the knowledge, but they've got all that other information in an archive. So it's still there, for community to access potentially. So that question of compromise is a really hard one too, because in a sense, making a book is potentially making another thing. You have your project and all its different stages, and the book is a separate entity itself. And, the collaboration with an editor is a really valuable one, because they do have an understanding about, you want your book actually to reach audiences, working out which audience that is and what will appeal is really valuable and really important. But you have to choose your publisher wisely as well, because, in Australia, we see that there is this danger that some publishers either consciously or unconsciously seem to make books that on First Nations themes that are palatable for a non-Indigenous audience. And so there is that danger, and maybe that's for commercial reasons, or also because people don't like the hard parts, the hard stories. But that's something really to be wary of. And so, that's actually why it's so important in Australia that an organisation like Mugabala Books exists, or Ardavani, or non-Indigenous or Indigenous publishers all over the world, because it's really about making sure there's an integrity of voice and truth-telling. And so it's just about, those are the things I would say to be aware of. I put on these last two slides, I've referred to a resource so Creative Australia is the Australian Commonwealth Government's funding body, and they have developed First Nations cultural and intellectual property protocols. And there is on the final slide, so this is, I think we've provided a link to this. This work's not just about publishing, it's actually across all art forms. And then Mugabala Books does have a case study in that document as well, if you download that. And I think one of the things about the protocols, though, is that even though, they're there, there's so many things that require common sense in between. It's quite often we used to have people, and I say we, it's a bit hard for me to divorce myself from Mugabala now, but Mugabala used to get calls from people who wanted to, go and talk to a community about a particular project. They said, we'll pay for people's time on following the protocols. But really, they didn't really understand that their insistence on being involved with the community was not welcome, but they weren't hearing that they weren't picking up all the subtle cues. Two, again, that people didn't want to reject them. It's very difficult for people to say no in the communities with which I've worked. So, I've had a look at the fellows who've been selected. I'm really excited by the range of the projects. And I think what was really exciting to me, Elika, about your presentation was seeing all of those contemporary projects that you've put there, and I think it makes me think too about how, you know, one of the words that when people join Mugabala Books, you know, the employees, one of the words that they're told that they're actually not allowed to use in relation to Aboriginal culture is traditional. And that's why in Australia there's this real binary that goes on, that there's what happened in the past is, you know, is traditional, and that is somehow to be frozen, but also better than what is happening now. You know, it's almost as if like what young people are producing is not authentic or something. It's really some crazy kind of logic, which I suppose is all about control in the end. And so, you know, there are so many community projects which are interesting, where people, especially elders, are really also want to see kids engaging with culture and trying to embrace apps and digital projects. So seeing, you know, your examples, you know, was really wonderful. I hope some people in Australia get to see that material as well. So I sort of say good luck to the fellows and to all of the communities with which you're working. And I hope this has been of some use to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing your insights and learnings. I just feel like there's so much possibility for, you know, it's as relevant there as it is here. And there could be so much more that we could work together on from the perspectives of both the countries. I'm sure Elika and others would agree with me on that. I think before I sort of pose some questions to you, is there any exchanges that you would like to have between the two of you and your presentation, just your talks? Any thoughts you'd like to share?
Elika, maybe I could make one sort of observation, is that when you were talking in that question about having that binary of the oral tradition versus the written record, I think it's so interesting, and also so sort of dangerous to set up those binaries. But in Australia too, it's sort of, I feel like gradually people are starting very slowly to realise just the enormous intellectual and cultural depth that oral knowledges contain, and also perhaps starting to understand the limitations of the written record as well. I think there's the danger of also the way the written record of oral histories are used as if they are the immutable truth, you know, that people need to refer back to. But I think it's a bit mind-blowing. I mean, now scientists are starting to say that Australian creation stories contain scientific knowledge that goes back, you know, 12, 20,000 years. It's probably more. And there's very little in the written record that contains that kind of information. And even we had an elder, there's a story about 3 elders from the Kimberley who went to the, what are those famous caves in France? I'm going to forget them now. They have the rock art. You will know the name of those caves. They're seen as like the oldest kind of rock art in the world, but it's not true. But when these men went there, they asked the French people, well, we know the name for that guy in Australia, the guy who made the spear thrower, and they could tell the story. But they asked the French people, what's his name? And when the French people said, well, we've got no idea what his name was, these gentlemen were horrified that such knowledge had been lost. And so it's, again, you know, the knowledge is spanning, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years. So I don't know, Elika, if that connects with what you were talking. I don't really have a question for you, but you just stimulated so many thoughts about that one key question. I feel like that could be unpacked in a session with Australian, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists.
Yeah. So Anna, and there's something about the way when we encounter different cultures, when we encounter, let's say, for example, I am second generation educated. So the way that I think and the way that my grandparents would have thought about what we term as culture, there is also a sense of probably my grandparents, if they had to see what the youngsters of today are doing, they would be aghast, right? That this is a complete chutneyfied version, right? As we say it, chutneyfied version. And it's a complete nonsense, is probably what they would say. Like, I want to take one example that I find very interesting is this young man who raps in Sumi, his native tongue. And yes, so many of the representations in his videos are about urban culture, crime, drug addiction, or perhaps even tribes fighting one another or having quarrels with one another, because this is something that we see in Nagaland, and I'm not shy in saying that there are differences that are there even within the internally within the tribes as well. So being able to say these things perhaps in a song, and perhaps in a song, because rap is something that is alien to us, right? If we have to look at the traditional way of singing, for example, rapping is something very alien, and I think it's come to us because of the American culture and so forth. But being able to use some of these questions, right, that like this boy is doing, and being able to say it in an adopted art form, if I can call it, that itself is very interesting. That itself is opening up to a whole lot more questions, and I think it opens up this field of studies that can be done around it, and understand what is happening to this idea of the modern, and modern is a very problematic word, the new Naga, right? The young Naga of today. So these are some of the key things that interest me as well. And I'm also very, in fact, when you were making a presentation, Anna, I was very struck by how the community is very strong in telling what their culture is about, what their knowledge is about, what their practices is about. And so this is something that I'm yet to see a little bit more closely, at least for Nagaland. And I think this is what I interested me in your talk as well. So yeah, I think we'll have more discussions around this.
Elika, I just found it so interesting how you also brought in many different forms, from music to food to blogging, like what you were terming, if I'm not mistaken, new media, and how that is all sort of, and this idea of a spectrum, orality and literacy is part of a spectrum and not just like one form that we're looking at. Connected to that, Anna, I was really interested in that one point in the mandate, of submissions that would not be accepted. And I'm just wondering about that when you speak about, I think there was a point when it says, I'm just trying to read it out. For example, a children's picture book manuscript by a non-Indigenous author with an Indigenous illustrator is ineligible. And, like when we are talking about or the sort of writing about oral cultures, in here, I would imagine that, if I'm a straightforward looking at it, is that there is an art form and there's somebody else who's writing. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that point.
Yeah, well, I think it comes back. I mean, the reason for that rule, has meant that Mangabala has had to reject actually some really lovely books. But it comes down to that question of whose story is it? And so, I think and look, I'll give you even an example, just without naming the book. There was another book that was produced by another publisher that was written by a non-Indigenous person about an Aboriginal themed story. And then an Indigenous illustrator was used to illustrate it. And whilst that was a positive experience, I think, for that illustrator, there was still there is a feeling from some Aboriginal people that that story was just a very soft telling of that story. I think if that story had been written by an Aboriginal person, it would be a slightly different story. And I think it's just because Mugabala Books' whole reason for existence is to ensure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices are represented, that it's like the text is of the representation of the story. And even though we know that an illustrator then can bring a kid's book to life, in a whole level of new meaning, it's still ultimately whose perspective and voice is it? Because it's such a nuanced thing, but it will be different. Is that what you're getting at, Mary?
Yes, I'm just trying to understand that a little bit more. So thank you for that. As Annalisa, my colleague, had mentioned that this is part of a series of talks, and we've started off in January with Professor Ganesh Devi. And I remember when I first came across his work, like almost 2 decades ago, on the dead and extinct languages of Arunachal Pradesh, there was a line he said that has always stayed with me, which is that when a language dies, an entire culture dies with it. And on that note, I was also wondering what your thoughts are, both of you, on the writing that is done, of the oral cultures that we interact with, whether it's, in the region of Northeast, of the Naga communities or other tribal communities across India, and in Australia, of the Indigenous First Nations Aboriginal, in English. Can you speak a little about that?
You want to go first, Anna?
I'm happy for you to, Elika.
So if I understand it correctly, Anna, you're talking about languages that are on the verge of extinction, you're saying, right?
No, Elika, my question is this, that, from the point of view of writing and research, there is a large amount of it from our region, which is being done in English. But the culture is in, whatever cultures we're talking about, the communities belong to another language, and what your thoughts are on that.
Okay. So I think there are 2 ways of seeing that. Actually, there is a large work of writing that is from Nagaland and is writing in English. But at the same time, there are also writings in local languages, in the native languages. So, but we don't read or see much about that because translation is still yet to be done, right? I mean, this brings us to the question of translation, because there is a whole body of work that is there, very precious work that is there that still needs to be translated and for the world to read. But at the same time, the new kinds of writings that are coming, like this today, like I mentioned when I was making a presentation also, there is a more of an effort to write, right? But at the same time, use new media to talk about one's own identity, one's own representation of what they think or feel is culture, right? So the 2 ways of seeing it: one, that the work is there, yet to be discovered, yet to be read. And this makes, again, right, there's lots of work to be done in that sense. So I would think of it in that way, I guess.
Thanks, Elika. Any thoughts from you, Anna?
Oh yes, my brain is filled with so many mixed thoughts, I think, because I mean, from a Mugabala Books perspective, a publishing perspective, there's one amazing book that we published. It was actually originally published by another publishing house, Fremantle Press, but they gave back the rights to this book, and it's called Two Sisters. And it's a very unusual book, because the first part of the story was two sisters who walked out of the desert in the 1960s to meet their first non-Indigenous people. One sister told her story to a non-Indigenous woman. Very exciting story, actually, as it was. And then when her sister found out, she said, well, I'm going to do my story. And her sister had learnt to write her own language. She didn't learn to write English. but she learnt to write her own language. And that was a kind of a result of work that missionaries had done. You know, they'd come to translate the Bible into Walmatjari, which is in central Kimberley region of WA. But then the community members decided they wanted to, you know, learn to translate things into their own language for all sorts of other practical purposes. And the most beautiful thing about the sister Jugana, who wrote her story in Walmatjari, and then it was published with a translation alongside, is just how powerful that direct first voice is. You know, it's like her unmediated voice. But, you know, when presenting that book to the market, I've raved about that book for so many years, that the sort of the market, the mainstream market, don't know what to do with it. I mean, people who do read it love it, but I think that's still, it's sort of interesting about thinking what the market is for those books. And there's so, around Australia too, it's really tricky because there's a lot of communities where languages has been lost and there's a lot of language revitalisation happening. And so in those cases, sometimes there are children's books that are being published in language to assist that revitalisation process. In the Kimberley region, you know, there's so many different languages, but also, you know, the kids are more likely, their first language may well be what's known as Creole or Aboriginal. Also, there's Aboriginal English is a slightly different language. I'm not a linguist, I must say, so I'm going to get things wrong probably. But and so this idea about what to publish, you know, in is tricky. There are some people are trying to publish books in Creole. So there are actually language centres that are Aboriginal controlled around the Kimberley, and they are doing that kind of highly specialised work rather than it coming into a publishing sphere. And so while there are those rare books that for Muggabala, like the Shirley Purdy book, they're quite rare because, you know, as a publishing house, we don't have the experience. But we do see that there's value, but also it's like as long as there is also access to the spoken word as well, I think that's so critical to make sure that this is a valuable resource down the track. Because I think actually something that comes out of Muggabala is people are always thinking about future generations.
I'll just add something that came to my mind as Anna was speaking, and that is about writing in our native tongues. Every tribe, as far as I know, every tribe has its own literature board, what we call the literature board. Whenever we write in our native tongue, this board oversees how it is written. One of the reasons that is given by this board why it has to be overseen or has to be checked by or scrutinized by the board is because of the usage of certain words which have been previously anglicized, and because we write in the Roman script, and therefore the sounds are not accurate to what the actual spoken word is. And so now there is a lot of trying to as Anna used the word revitalize, right? Trying to revitalize the written word, and especially the dictionaries in the native tongue, the spoken word, how it sounds in the spoken word. So there is a lot of linguistic work that is going on in terms of trying to capture the exact sounds of the words that are used, for example. So, and this is also becoming a little bit challenging because many would like to write. It comes out, and the writing also comes out in the forms of pamphlets or short monographs, and they write in their own ways, even the native tongue. So the spelling might not be an accurate representation of the sound, for example. So in fact, the Sumi Bible, the new version of the Sumi Bible has emerged again. I find it difficult to read because I was so used to reading the previous versions that the new versions, there are many, even let's say a Bible verse has the way we have memorized it in Sunday school is so different now, right? The new version is so different, and these are new words that is seen. So again, this is even more challenging for me, even as a native speaker, right? So yeah, I think I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and in fact, Elika, one thing, something you've been referring to quite a bit is this idea of translation. And then, even here, like within the different language boards, even in the Naga community, um, just coming back to this writing like of oral and living traditions, I'm wondering if a lot has been sort of at least because I've been in the space of publishing and books for a while now. There is a lot that we've sort of unpacked, and in terms of processes and ways of thinking of translation in text from one language to the other. But do you think that that would be a similar way, and would we use that same lens when we're looking at writing the oral? Or, I mean, you did mention at some point, which I thought was very interesting for me as well, the idea of a spectrum, But when we're translating or we're writing something which has not been written before, uh, what are some of those, what are your thoughts on what kind of lens it should be? Should it only be from the translation lens, or could there be other ways of looking at it?
Uh, no, I think it's not just translation, right? When we are trying to look at it from the oral, um, it has to go back to the community, back to the elders, back to the practices, the knowledges that are there. And I think there is a lot of like from a research point of view, right? What do we have to do? We have to go back to the field again. And I think there's a lot of effort that needs to go into trying to understand what are the ways in which we can capture it, because this oral cultures, as I mentioned, right? And we know that, right? That no one rendition of a story, right? There are many, many renditions of a particular story, and how we capture it today would not be the same as perhaps last week, right? So there are variations in many stories, and that sense of the storyteller. You hear me?
Yes, I think I lost you for a second there. I'm not sure if it's my
Yes, I think I
connection or
lost.
yours. Yeah.
I don't know where you all lost me, but let me just repeat my point, that the many, many renditions of a particular story. And that a lot also depends on the storyteller, right? And the storyteller's own experiences. So in that sense, there's a lot of more work that has to go in, right? A lot more effort that has to go in. And it all goes back to the people again, the community again. Yeah.
I think also somewhere related is, what Anna has been referring to as the marketplace. And the way I think of it is actually like perhaps the ecosystem, which includes the publishing houses, the literary festivals, all of the places that basically holds the writings specifically. And I'm also wondering, I keep wondering about the linkage of these platforms, that platform writing and books, and the ways in which it impacts how and who tells the stories. I don't know if you have just that. I just wanted to put that last question out before I sort of open it out to everyone. Any thoughts on that?
Perhaps if I can just say that, I'm going to quote Rachel Binsella again. I think she's been asked a lot about this question, and she says that she thinks it's a great shortcoming of the Australian literary scene that great literature is expected to come from highly literate peoples. That idea that the focus is on the form, and it's infused by notions of class. And so, Rachel says it's the story, and that is the critical thing, or it's the content. And so it's a very different cultural lens, because the Western, lens is so obsessed with form and prestige, and etc. So I think that it's really important to try and reverse that process to empower people to be able to tell their story the way they want to. But also taking perhaps just one side step back to your last question, Mary, I think in Australia, some of the most exciting work, perhaps is not in this space, especially the space that Elika is talking about, is in what some linguists are doing in Australia. And I'm going to name somebody, I hope she doesn't mind, but Anna Crane's been working with the Gidja community, the same Warman community, and she's been doing some really interesting work. But her work was her study was very much informed by what the elders wanted, and it's not just about recording language, but it's also the context. So her work is about Gurara, which is speaking to country. So the ways in which Gidja people speak to country, which also relates to ritual and ceremony. And so it's sort of like a package. And she's working out, I think, with the community how that information goes back in a practical form. And I think that's some of that. So that's outside the marketplace. That's very much for the community. But that's really some of the exciting stuff, because in a sense the market does, and I'm calling it the market because publishing, it's very hard to get outside of that, and you've really got to push back. And if you want to push back against the market forces, you've got to be resourced to do it in some way, or you've got to have your allies, people helping you with money to help you do that. But if you're doing it in a community context, there's greater freedom.
Thanks, Anna. Any thoughts, Elika?
No, I just had this thought, right, that it's a lot. I don't know, if I were to think, step into your shoes, Anna, and to think like a publisher. Yeah, I would be constantly plagued by whether these books would sell or not, right? Because it's not for everybody's taste, right? Or not, it's not always palatable to everybody. But it's also essential because the tough stories, the difficult stories are need to be out there. There is a tendency for us to capture stories or write stories in the text form, stories that are palatable, stories that have a pretty ending, right? A nice ending, but it's not always the case, right? And for the Nagas as well, there are many stories of violence. There are many stories of oppression that are there, right? But not many go beyond the borders of Nagaland, I would say. I mean to say that not many go out there. It needs to be out there, right? But it's very difficult to do that because these stories also tell of an oppressor, and the oppressor has a greater say in most cases. So these are the difficulties. And then if you're thinking from a community perspective and trying to tell of all of the stories, because we may have the creation stories, we may have the sewing stories, the festival stories, and so forth. But what about the difficult stories, right? We don't want to forget that as well, because it's also part of our community, right? And so I think it's also important equally to look across the spectrum as well, as I mentioned earlier, and to see and to try to dig into our own stories, our own testimonies in that sense. So yeah, I think I would have a tough time trying to sell my books if I had to.
I think that's a good sort of note to sort of open it up to the public, because I hope that with this platform, the Himalayan Fellowship, that this is a platform that does want to also listen to the difficult stories and not just the ones that are celebrating certain aspects of culture. I think we have a question from To Yala. To, would you like to read out the question yourself, or would you like me to read it out? Are you here? We'd love to see your faces, some of you, if you'd like to put on your videos. Toy, shall I read out your question? Can you see it, Elika? Okay. Toy is on the road, I think. So there's a question which is addressed to you. Would you say that today the word Naga, can you read it? Would you say that today the word Naga itself, a term given to them by outsiders, has become a strong element of their self-identity? For example, popularizing the spices and herbs as Naga chili or Naga dhanya, when these are also commonly found in other non-Naga communities of Northeast. or the more
Right.
recent branding of coffee from Zuhineto as Nagaland coffee. Here in Delhi, I also see many Naga restaurants and Naga kitchen. I find it interesting that there is so much more emphasis on the word Naga to show one's Naga-ness. I think you can read the rest.
Yes, so cognac is more
Interesting
closely
question. Yeah.
Moncho from English. Okay. Okay, so yes, it is a term, it is a term, a name that is given to us by outsiders. And now we have owned it. And now we are, now we are, like, actually, there you have said Zinhe Noto, but that's Zinaboto. Okay. Now, everything is Naga, everything. I'm just trying to get a sense of this. Yes, everything is Naga, everything. And my whole presentation was about Naga-ness. So I'm just finding it very funny. But yes, I think what's wrong with saying being a Naga? There's nothing wrong with saying being a Naga, although it may say, I would say, yes, I am Assumi Naga, right? Probably I would attach my tribe to the term Naga, because the world has come to know us for this term that has been given to us by outsiders. Now I cannot, even I have to say I'm from Nagaland, right? So there are geographical markers, placemakers that have been now stamped onto us, right? So I don't see there is anything different in saying that we are sort of capitalizing on the Nagas. But yes, I do get your question that there is also a tendency, there is also the possibility that it could be exoticized. The idea of the Naga could be exoticized. And yes, it is often marketed that way as well. I don't disagree. People have different ways of representing themselves. But yeah, yes, it is true that this term that has been given to us by outsiders, we have come to own it. And we're rather proud of it, actually. So yeah, that's my response.
I think there was a point when you were talking about what you would talk about today, Elika, and this term you use, which is like cultural encounters in the Naga context being both precious and precarious. I think that that struck me as something I want to think more about. So perhaps this too. Joshua, please. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. I do have a few questions. It's hard to articulate in writing in the text, so I'll try to figure that out as I go along. But thank you all for like sharing your wonderful thoughts, the practices, and just getting into this really, I don't know, this weird territory of archiving oral traditions in a medium that's so fixed, like something like writing. And that brings me to this question of how do you, I don't know, it's really hard for me to articulate this. Let me just give a bit of a back history. So I come from Mizoram, and I feel like compared to the other regions of the Northeast or the Himalayan region, I just feel like, this is personal opinion, I just feel like a lot of the cultural history and cultural knowledge of the Mizos is lost because of time, because of Christianity, various influences, but I feel like our grasp of cultural knowledge is so fragmented at this point. However, like through this research that I'm doing with the Himalayan Fellowship and also just talking, there is a lot of writing. A lot of the Mizo elders were writing their own journals. But the problem then, like when I've spoken to people in the academic circles and also in publishing, is that these writings they kind of don't meet the rigor or the kind of check marks that you would be able to use these as primary sources, is what I've been told, because they are like, you can't, because of how people document their personal diaries, some things you can't say for sure this happened, years are not recorded, or there are some things left out. So in those situations, maybe both of you can share your thoughts, like how do you then validate these kinds of writings to be brought into I don't know, some publishing realm, like kind of to safeguard it so that it's not just someone's diary? Like, how do you bring these kinds of histories or stories into, I don't know, formal writing? Or like maybe even the question is also, what can I say to like friends or people of this generation in how to like start writing their stories, especially in kind of safeguarding stories from their grandmothers or grandparents? Because one other problem that I identify, like again, personal opinion, is that although the language of education in Mizoram is English, a lot of Mizos find it difficult to articulate in English. And then on top of that, like maybe in the next generation, as the kids in school right now become older, they will be able to overcome this language barrier. But by then, the people who know cultural history, the people who have seen a different kind of Mizoram before this rapid urbanization, and they would have probably passed away. So you'd have to bridge like a gap of maybe 4 generations. So I don't know if you can still find the questions in this very long responses. So how then do you say is like, how should we then document? How should we then write? Or what are the kind of tools you can share for, I don't know, bringing these kinds of personal diaries or stories that we hear? Like, how do we archive it? How do we safeguard it for future generations, let's say?
Would either of you like to take that?
I lost you for some time out there, Joshua. So, but from what I can understand, and I might be wrong because I lost a lot, I had to log in back again. But from what I can understand, you're thinking about whether there can be any authenticity in terms of personal narratives or the autobiographies, and whether you can use it as a strong source, as you mentioned, primary source, right, for any work. And then you also mentioned something about safeguarding stories or these safeguarding narratives. I don't know to what extent we can safeguard narratives. And and that was the whole point of my presentation as well, that is there a way in which we can sort of safeguard one story, especially in our oral culture? I don't know. I have some doubts about that. And second of all, the way, if I were to use, let's say, personal narratives and autobiographies, I think that those are fascinating. For me, I think because I've used such narratives even in my own work as well, and in my own research work as well. And I find that fascinating because you get really a snippet into the person's mind, right? And you get to see there might not be 100% accuracy, and so that authenticity might be questioned by somebody, but you get to see the narrative of that person, right? And I think that holds a value as well. So that's how I would put my that's how I would consider the personal narratives. If I have answered your question, maybe Anna, you might want to say something a little bit more.
I would definitely agree with what Elika has said about the personal narratives. I think so much of what Magabala Books has published has been personal narratives, because within each personal narrative there is the truth, and it's that person's truth. But even when it comes, it's very interesting in Australia, or Magabala published this book called Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, and the conservative commentators in Australia went crazy. They just said, no, it's not true. It's not, he hasn't told Australian history the right way. And they were obsessed with sources. The interesting thing is that when he was getting ready to make that book, the irony is he found colonial sources to use, which is the only reason that he felt people took him seriously. But he said before that, he said, this is what people told me. People know this. There's so much in oral history the truth that people know. And so at Mugabala Books, where you know, Mugabala is different. The publishing team is different in its approach, in that it stands behind those personal narratives, you know, because each personal narrative is important. And, you know, I think I would encourage that diary writing. But just on the other question that you just stimulated another thought, though, is that in terms of also the future generations, is that sometimes if somebody is not speaking in their first language, then, you know, some of the detail and nuance can be lost. And so I come back to that idea about multiple forms of recording, and that can be saved in perpetuity. And I don't have an answer in terms of archives and how you make sure that where these things can be saved for future generations, or how you get somebody to try and transcribe and translate as accuracy as possible so you have a record. But I regret that 25 years ago, when I was at Walman Art Centre, we had these, you know, VHS cameras were not all that common. And, you know, I regret my bungled attempts to do translation when I didn't have access to any linguists that think that stories were simplified, you know, that shouldn't have been simplified, but it was this precious time where these elders were still alive. And there's obviously within the community so many layers of cultural transmission is happening all the time. It's not relying on, you know, non-Indigenous people like me. It's happening in all areas, but just in terms of where you find those archive records, I think that, you know, that digital record as well as the transcription is really valuable.
Joshua, does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit, just lots to reflect on. So thank you.
Yeah, but from what I understood in the beginning, when you were, starting off, you mentioned this, that in the landscape as such of Mizo writings that are available, if I understood correctly, that you found that actually, a lot of what has been written is very fragmented. And so there was no gauge of actually what you could sort of, in a way, take as authentic. And so there's still very less that has been written, and therefore there should be more. And that's something you'd like to work with. Did I get that correctly? And how should that be done?
No, just in terms of, I think maybe this can be addressed more to Anna, if I might pick your brains a little bit once again. It's more in terms of, I was recently talking to a few scholars and academics in terms of trying to piece together bits of our cultural history. Yes, it's very fragmented, but when I asked, like, there are diaries, there are a lot of people who kept journals, like, especially my grandfather's generation, they're very good at journal keeping. But the problem then, like when I was talking to some scholars or publishers also, is that a lot of the times they can't print or publish these for, I don't know, to make it more accessible because of the way it's written. They were saying, like, in academic circles, there are certain criteria you need to meet for writing to be then moved into, I don't know, I guess the next level of publishing or the next level of documentation or archiving things. So I think it's more on, like, what are the key factors that we should keep in mind in terms of now then knowing that there is this very fragmented but lots of recordings of personal narratives. How then should we, I don't know, at this point, maybe even for this research, how then do we write about it? Like, what are the kind of tools that one should keep in mind so that maybe later these writings, or if perhaps I read 4 or 5 diaries and I make like some summaries, like what are the kind of ways to overcome this barrier so that we can take it forward into, like, maybe publishing, or maybe even like to use it in scholarly articles or in academic language? Because recently, last week when I was at one of the Mizoram universities, like even one of the professors said, it's very hard to articulate the reason they gave me, but they also said that oftentimes we cannot take these as sources, even if people wish to publish or use it in their PhD dissertations or use it as background. Like they have to find different citations. So to kind of overcome these problems, like how should people keep diaries or journals of their first-hand accounts? I think that's one way of rephrasing.
I think, Joshua, the problem, though, you said it yourself, you see, this is the problem with academia. And I mean, that's one of the things you see about Magabala Books is not an academic publisher, it's a trade publisher. But, you know, of that book that I gave you the example, you know, it was a trade book, not an academic book. And the academics criticised this book left, right and centre. They couldn't stand, you know, so many of them couldn't stand it because it didn't have the right, you know, kind of, it wasn't in depth enough or all the right references in their minds. But this is the cultural tension. You know, this is actually different worldviews coming up against each other. And so I think that if your aim is for the academic outcome, it is going to be it's going to be difficult. And I don't think, this is beyond me because I'm not an academic and I've not worked in the academic scheme, you know, environment. But I think that it would be very hard to sort of foolproof a process to ensure that it could be used for academia. But I think if you're able to weave those narratives together in some thematic way, there's a story that will be important there to be told. And sort of, I know it might not help to say stuff the academics, but it's kind of like that's how we have felt at Magabala, because so much wouldn't have been written, so much wouldn't have been published if we had used those standards. So there is some level of subversion that needs to happen and thinking about the different market.
I'll just add something.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'll just add something, Joshua. You see, in academia, we are trained to support our statements with scholarly work and archival work. So for example, I'll give you an example from my own presentation today. I had to make a statement with regard to the missionary schools, and so it was there in my presentation about the missionaries, and I had to go back and look at a valid source. I know it was would demonize the Nagas, and I know it's there because I've heard this from my grandparents before they became Christian and so forth, right? I know it's there, but I had to go back and search for that exact explanation, and so I found I was able to find and there are many as well in academic journals about this particular point that I was trying to make as well. So I found quite a few and I added one, right? So you see, there is a training that is in academia that we have to support our statements with existing scholarly work. But I would, because I also have a love of literature and I'm a student of literature. So my grandfather had almost an OCD way of keeping records. So for example, did I lose you or something? I don't know. Okay.
Just for a few seconds.
Yeah. So in one of his notebooks, he wrote exact time, date, and the place where each of his children were born, exact time as well. And the one about my grandmother giving birth to the children and whether the birth was difficult or not, right? And I still have scanned images of that. And I think it's wonderful because it's authentic, right? It's his way of narrating the experience of being a father, right? And if I had to include this in my scholarly work, I would still do it, right? There are ways of doing it. There are ways of putting together personal narratives in a scholarly work, right? And I think that is a training that you will be getting as well, right? And I believe you're also one of the fellowship, right? He's part of the fellowship as well, isn't he, Mary? Yeah, so I think you'll be getting your training on how to insert those narratives into your own work as well. So don't shy away, I would say, from these personal narratives, because there are a lot of interesting things that can come from it. And sometimes don't listen to us snobby academics.
Can I just add, I didn't give any respect either to any of the academics who are listening about in my coarse Australian manner. But I have worked for a rebel publisher, so that's why we speak fairly directly. But it would be very interesting. There are some First Nations academics in Australia who are really pushing back in that same way, saying no, it's valid to keep these oral histories as our sources, that they're not, because to say you can only include a source that's been written down at some point by another person, often a non-Indigenous person, doesn't work. So, there'll be people who have a very similar approach to you, Elika, I'm sure.
I think you had also mentioned at some point, Anna, when looking at how to examine these collaborations in a project, about really sort of unpacking it right in the beginning as to why you want to do a certain kind of book or the story that you want to tell. So perhaps, I don't know, Joshua, when we are talking about, because academic publishing is a very different space from trade publishing. And then there is also all of the other kinds of publishers in the middle, as in like the zine space, I think is so interesting in terms of a place to experiment with. In fact, Fika at the moment, I don't know, Annalisa, if it's still there, the installation, the Brito Arts installation there, right? Which is like the books which is being published by the Brito Arts Trust. And I think that what you're talking about, in fact, this might be a great example to look at. What do you think, Annalisa? Right. So, I mean, there are many spaces, so maybe this conversation could be something that we could take forward. I'm afraid we are sort of now already 2 hours. It's been really insightful and so lively. I think you've given us so much to think about, Anna and Elika. Thank you so much. Um, and I'm afraid I won't be able to take any more questions. But thank you so, so much for making the time, for being part of this conversation, all of you who've listened through this time. In fact, on Joshua's question, because the next lecture, just to let you know that the next lecture is by Professor Joy Pachau, and it is titled Negotiating Modernity in Colonial and Post-Colonial Mizoram. So, Joshua, that would be interesting for you and for others too. It will be on the 3rd of April, and the information will be out on our different platforms. With that, I will say thank you again to our speakers, to Fika, to all of you who've participated today, and a very good evening to all of you.
Thank you,
so much.
Mary, as well, I think, for your really sensitive moderation and for those lovely questions. I think this has been a really lovely learning evening for us. So, yeah, thank you all for staying tuned in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.